The outcome of the example we just considered in the last video leads into one of the major criticisms of act utilitarianism, that it doesn't count individual rights. For example, we might think that you have rights that don't necessarily tie into your pleasure, like the right to know about your own medical condition. We're going to talk about some of the major challenges or problems with act utilitarianism and how rule utilitarianism attempts to address those. So here are some of the major issues with act utilitarianism. First, there are difficulties with calculation, and we can divide those into issues of time and issues with unforeseen consequences. The next issue is the one we already began to talk about, and there are two related but distinct issues that we'll group under the heading of the sacrifice of the individual to the whole. And those are the tyranny of ethics and the tyranny of the majority and lack of individual rights. So let's start with difficulties with calculation. There are two major problems with utility calculation under this model. First, it takes a while to calculate out all of the potential foreseeable consequences of the set of possible actions every time you need to make an ethical decision. The simple fake example we used took quite a while, and that had limited available options and an artificially imposed set of information. A real situation would be much more complicated, so it can be very burdensome just at the level of doing the calculation to try to figure out what to do. Second, utility calculation is uncertain and open to mistakes. Even for the immediate consequences of an action, it's often really difficult to anticipate all of the results, much less for consequences further down the road. We've spoken quite a lot about the fact that ethics deals with human interactions and that these are very, very complex and full of all sorts of moving parts and interactions among those moving parts. I'm sure you have all had experiences where you were very surprised at the consequences of some action you took and hadn't anticipated those consequences at all. So it can be quite difficult to accurately do that utility calculus because there's a lot of uncertainty embedded in each of the steps. The other major issue is the sacrifice of the individual to the whole. We'll start with the problem I am calling the tyranny of ethics. And just so you know, the tyranny of ethics is a name I made up for this issue. It is not a common term for it. So another problem is that we might think it's too much to ask people to constantly subvert their own preferences on an issue for the benefit of everybody else. In other words, we often have personal preferences, and almost any action you can think of has potential ethical consequences. For all actions with a potential ethical consequence, must you always decide to do what would maximize utility for everyone else? Are you obligated, for example, to find out whether General Mills or Quaker has better job protection and retirement benefits for its workers before you decide whether to buy Cheerios or Life cereal for breakfast? And yet, your support of the company has a marginal consequence for that company, and your failure to pay attention to workplace issues in your purchases makes a difference in terms of whether the company changes its policies for the better. So we get this issue where it looks like your own preferences are always being subverted to the common good. Another major issue is that in the act utilitarian formulation, there's no recognition of individual rights, and thus no inherent limit on what can be done to promote the greatest good for the greatest number. What if, for example, there's a small minority group in your society and the majority decides they would get enormous pleasure from being freed from domestic labor, so they will simply make the minority group do all the domestic labor for everyone? The members of the minority might be made very unhappy, but if you have a large majority group and they are all very happy because they're free of this labor, it's not clear we shouldn't do it under act utilitarianism. In our example from the first video, we saw that if there's just a single person being treated unfairly in your workplace, for example, and you might suffer from negative repercussions if you try to help that person, it might be the case that act utilitarianism would counsel you not to help. Further, there doesn't seem to be any recognition of a right you would hold if it didn't connect to your pleasure. For example, the right to know about your health, assuming the knowledge will not make you happy and you can't be helped by the knowledge. Harriet Taylor and John Stuart Mill are really concerned about these issues, and while they are committed to utilitarianism, they find these problems really troubling. Part of what they're doing in On Liberty is attempting to address those problems within utilitarianism. That is, they'll try to work out a solution to the problem without relying on anything beyond utility. In our next video, we'll examine the shift they make within the utilitarian principle and how that changes the way we make our utility calculus. Then we'll move on to looking at the ways in which they think this shift solves the problems we just talked about. Thank you, and I will see you soon.